Okay, we're now recording this session. So good morning again to all of you. I hope that you're well this morning. And I also hope that you enjoyed our introduction to paradox and puzzle last week with Zeno's paradoxes, or Zeno if you prefer. I hope you had some fun with those. And we're going to continue this work in the remaining weeks of this course. And I think the paradoxes and the puzzles will get deeper since we've managed to resolve Zeno's paradoxes pretty clearly, I think, except once again, that caveat applies that when we resolve a paradox, we usually have to make some kind of cognitive shift or epistemological shift in our understanding of the world as a sort of price or a transaction cost, if you prefer, of that resolution, or whatever it may be. But usually that's somehow an improvement of our understanding. So we're all willing, and there's been tremendous endeavor over the centuries on the part of philosophers and mathematicians and physicists and others to solve paradoxes, be they logical or empirical. So this is one of the things that we like to do. We like to pose difficult questions to ourselves and then find solutions to them. And it's a good way of advancing our knowledge of the world and our understanding in general. All right, so we're going to continue this project with a very famous paradox. I think it's a paradox, although it's called an argument. It's very puzzling because it purports to prove the existence of God by logical means, pretty much by logical means alone. And most people would probably agree. You don't have to agree, but many of you may agree that belief in God is really about faith. Is it not? If we talk about people believing, it usually means that they have faith. Believers have faith. And conversely, if we speak about people losing their faith, usually people who lose their religion or who, let's say, abandon their religion, have lost their faith. That's the normal expression. So it has something to do with faith, which has in turn something to do with belief, and not really anything to do with logic per se. That's a normal way of looking at things. But we have this 1,000-year-old argument from St. Anselm, a Christian monk of the 11th century, who gave us historically, I think, the most fascinating attempt to prove God's existence by logical means. And that's what we're going to look at this week, both his argument as it stands, and also on Thursday with my breakout group, and hopefully with your breakout groups too, you'll continue to look at his argument and also at some of the classic objections that have been made to it. And there are a number of philosophers whom we've already studied this term in other contexts, such as Kant and Hume, and Descartes. Others have made objections to this argument, not because they necessarily disbelieved in God, but because they were attempting to pick out some flaw in the argument itself. So this, criticizing Anselm, on the one hand, has really nothing to do with whether you believe in God or not. It has to do with what may or may not be flawed in his actual argument. Okay, that's a separate matter, I think, entirely from one's personal faith. But be that as it may, it's very unusual in philosophy for an argument to persist over 1,000 years. And there are still books and articles and conferences on Anselm's ontological argument. So I think it's really worthy of our consideration. I certainly enjoy it to this day. And I think that you're going to enjoy it as well. All right. So before we actually dive in to Anselm, I'm going to outline his argument today and make sure that most of you at least understand it. It's not that difficult, although there's a sort of a light that needs to come on for you to grasp what he's really saying. But before we tackle his actual text, or at least my summary of his argument, I want to say a few things to you about a word that's very much sometimes abused, and that's a word called proof. And you know that in philosophy, I'm sure you know by now, that sometimes an argument is a synonym for a proof. Why? Because an argument proceeds from premises and then argues for some conclusion. And if one can be satisfied by the demonstration, in other words, that the conclusion indeed follows validly from the premises, then one would then say that there's some kind of a proof that's been offered, or at least a very strong argument. So those words, proof and argument, are sometimes interchangeable. And in the context of Anselm, they are indeed, because he's calling it it's called the ontological argument, but it is in fact meant to be a proof. So there's a case of interchangeability. Also, you should realize, however, that this word proof is often overextended into domains where we don't really consider things like proofs to have been established. And I'm speaking specifically of empirical domains. People often talk about science proving this or that or the other thing, or statistics proving this or that or the other thing. And I think when we look at applied domains, such as science, experimental science, or indeed statistics, which is applied mathematics, the word proof is much more suspect, and I would be chary of using it. I would not, if I were you, use the word proof. What science generally does is it demonstrates, it hypothesizes, it explains, it predicts, but it doesn't prove things in a conclusive way. It may, in fact, confirm something so often that we become convinced of that thing's veracity. We're said to have, for example, a degree of belief that certain laws may hold everywhere in the universe, or a degree of belief that certain scientific laws have held from the beginning of time and will continue to do so. That's not a proof of anything, strictly speaking. That's just a great deal of certainty, which is reinforced by the constancy with which we observe the consistency of those laws. Every time we make, some relevant observation, that law is confirmed. But you should realize, and I hope most of you do realize, that confirmation is not the same as proof, because all you need in order to, quote unquote, disprove such a thing would be one instance of disconfirmation. Yeah. So if you suppose that all birds fly, you might get confirmation after confirmation, because every bird you see happens to be a bird that flies. And so you might tend to believe that all birds fly, but you're never going to prove that merely by observing a very large number of birds. Because as soon as you see an ostrich, you're going to realize that there's a bird that doesn't fly. So that provides a disconfirmation, right? So science doesn't prove that birds fly. It merely suggests to us from our experience that most birds fly, but not all of them. Okay, so that's why we don't want to use the word proof when we're speaking about the world. The word proof is much more reliably confined to logical and mathematical demonstrations. So Nicole asked, what word would we replace proof with? In science, we would talk about confirmation. We would say, for example, that such and such a theory is very strongly confirmed by experiment or by observation. Yeah. And similarly, in statistics, you can use statistics to make any argument whatsoever. So it's never a proof. A statistic is not a relation, it's a correlation. It may be indicative of an underlying cause. Some of you realize this, but things which are statistically correlated are not things that are necessarily derived from one another. So what you have with statistics is two variables being correlated, but that doesn't necessarily mean, or it certainly does not prove, that one causes the other. I mean, for example, to give you a ridiculous example, but one that holds up statistically, after a certain age, we start to lose brain cells, on a daily basis. And we also know that the universe is expanding. So we could correlate, human loss of brain cells in senior citizens negatively with the expansion of the universe. There's a negative correlation there, but I don't think anyone in their right mind would assert that, my loss of brain cells is causing the universe to expand, or conversely, that the expansion of the universe is causing my loss of brain cells. Those seem to be unrelated phenomena. So one doesn't causally relate to the other. And so one could not reliably prove any relationship, right? So that's another example, I think, of the inappropriateness of the word proof. Are religious proofs really true proofs? Well, Ahmed, you're begging the question here. We'll get to that when we talk about Anselm. Are religious proofs true proofs? I would say no, for the same reasons. But the real challenge for us will be to assess Anselm's so-called proof or his ontological argument, and then figure out what's wrong with it. Because if we can't find anything wrong with it, then it appears that it really is able to prove the existence of God by logic. And most of us would think prima facie that that's not possible. Again, belief in God would tend to be, most of us, I think, fair to say, would suppose that's a question of faith, not a question of proof. So it's a bit shocking that he came up with a proof for God's existence. And that's why we're still debating it 1,000 years later. Okay, there isn't any real firm consensus on how it goes wrong and where it goes wrong. That's what makes it interesting. And another thing, Ahmed and others, since you're asking about this, if we're going to try to quote unquote prove things about theology, we're going to very quickly get into hot water. There are a number of very trivial paradoxes that could be generated by attempting to extend our normal, I'm saying normal or, accepted logical means of argumentation to theological turf, which seems to be off limits to logic. For example, I'll give you a trivial example, okay, but one that's quite well known. Maybe some of you know it already. We would generally say, if we speak about God, we talk about God as being omnipotent, omnipresent, and also omniscient, right? Omnipotent, I'll type those words in, meaning all powerful, right? When we talk about God or believe in God, generally, we would say, certainly in the Abrahamic faiths, that God is omnipotent, meaning all powerful, right? Omniscient, meaning all knowing, right? God supposedly knows everything, right? Omnipotent, omniscient, and also omnipresent, meaning everywhere. God is everywhere. There's nowhere where God is not, presumably. So those are three supposed attributes that we accord to God. So here's a trivial paradox. Well, let's suppose God to be omnipotent, right? God is all powerful. So if God is all powerful, then God can do anything, correct? I mean, that's what it means. To be all powerful means to be able to do anything. Yes? I mean, you know that I'm leading you into a trap, but just play along with me, okay? If God is all powerful, it means that God can do anything, correct? I mean, strictly on the meaning of the word omnipotent. Are you with me? Okay, so then simple question. If God is all powerful, okay, you're with me. Fine. So now here's how we spring the trap. If God is all powerful, if God is omnipotent, then there's nothing God cannot do. So that leads to a simple question. Can God make a stone so heavy that he can't lift it? I'll type in the question. Can God make a stone so heavy? Can God make a stone so heavy that he can't lift it? Well, you see the problem, you see the paradox, heavy. I've misspelled heavy, but in any case, heavy. Can God make a stone so heavy that he can't lift it? Well, if yes, okay, so Dylan says yes, but then if you say yes, then there's something God can't do. Namely, he can't lift that stone. But if you say no, then there's something that God can't do, namely make such a stone. So whether you answer yes or no to that question, it appears that we've identified something God cannot do. And therefore, God cannot be omnipotent. So we've managed to derive a contradiction, yes? If God is omnipotent, God can do anything. But can God make a stone so heavy he can't lift it? Either way, apparently not. So, I'm not asking whether God can make a heavy stone, Ahmed. I'm asking whether God can make a stone so heavy that he can't lift it. And if you're going to say to me, yes, God can do anything, therefore God can make a stone so heavy that he can't lift it, but then he can, in any case, then this is a contradiction as well. So, I think this is a fairly trivial kind of a paradox, but what it demonstrates to me, you may want to think about this seriously. I don't take it seriously. But what it demonstrates to me is that logic does not really have a place. Logical arguments do not really have a place in theological contexts. Okay, that's the difference. The word theological has the same root, obviously is logical. But when we're speaking about theological matters, we're speaking about matters that are really quite beyond logic. I think that logic is a fairly powerful but confined, has a confined range of applicability. So the theological is not so amenable to logical argumentation, in my view. Okay, you want to think about it yourselves. Isn't that implying that God has a physical body with strength like ours? Well, again, Taisha, it implies a lot of possibilities, but I mean, if God created the universe, then God, created stones, and yeah, certainly it implies God has a physical body if we're talking about something lifting stones. But I mean, lifting if God created the universe, then that implies something much bigger and heavier than a stone. So I don't know if it implies that God has a physical body or not. But I think that kind of question, Taisha, just is loaning credence to the notion that logic does not really apply to theology, that they're really quite two different subjects. Okay? Fair enough? Fair enough? So we can get ourselves into all kinds of paradoxes, maybe by supposing various things about God that we really ourselves don't quite understand. Is this clear? And that's why we don't usually try to use logic in theological domains. Okay, so that's clear. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this sort of trivial question, but you see that we can invent or concoct paradoxes that may or may not really hold water. All right. Yes, Ahmed, I understand what you want to say. And again, you're saying that God can lift anything, but that's not our question. If our question is, can God lift anything because God created motion, then we have to say yes. But our question was concocted to pose a more complicated challenge. Our question is not, can God lift anything, but can God create a stone so heavy that God can't lift it? And then you have to answer yes or no. And then whichever way you answer, you're going to be admitting that there's something God cannot do. And that's precisely why I'm suggesting that the normal rules of logic do not apply very well in theological domains. Okay, logic and theology are very, very different subjects. All right. So Anselm's argument is much more serious, much more robust, and I think is going to leave you with a lot more food for thought. You're welcome. I'm glad you see this. That's a fairly trivial thing. But we have to cover a bit more ground before we actually go into Anselm's argument itself. I want now to go back to this question of proof and help to clarify for you some possible misconceptions about proof, but also to demonstrate on a positive vein that there are really three kinds of proofs that we, in terms of structure, there are basically three kinds of proofs that we admit in logical and mathematical contexts, and those are direct proofs, indirect proofs, and inductive proofs. And I'm going to give you an illustration of each so that you can see what we're operating with in terms of structures, and also so that you can appreciate that Anselm's proof is of the second kind. Anselm's ontological argument is what we call an indirect proof. And indirect proofs are a little bit different from direct proofs. I'm going to show you some slides, and they're in your Google Drive folder anyway, but this will hopefully illustrate for you the difference between a direct proof, an indirect proof, sometimes called a reductio, and an inductive proof. And all three are used regularly in logic and mathematics, and there isn't that much of a problem with them. But when we utilize them in outside of those contexts, in more general contexts, in more with more natural language semantics, then we can get ourselves, or with empirical arguments, we can get ourselves into hot water. So let me share this with you, and I think it'll become clearer what we're talking about. All right, just give me a second. Share screen, and this is in your folders. So there are three kinds of proofs. Basically, I'm saying to you there are essentially three kinds of proofs. The direct proof, so-called direct proof, which is indeed the most convincing of the three. Indirect proofs, which can be suspect, they generally work very well. In logic and mathematics, they work fine. They're a little bit suspect in semantic context, and I'll give you an example of why that might be. And finally, inductive proofs. And I would say they're fine in mathematics and logic. We need them, in fact, to prove certain things. But in empirical context, you have to really handle them with care. Inductive statements, which is, a generalization, a universalization, which is kind of a leap to a certain level made from very, very specific or limited observations, is always dangerous, is always fraught with hazard. So you want to be careful about inductive arguments. All right, so here's quick examples of each. Again, I'm asserting that direct proofs work best. They're very satisfactory. Why? Because in a direct proof, you're moving from premises to deductions, from premises to a conclusion ultimately, and each step can be justified. A direct proof is very satisfactory because every step is justified either by an axiom, that is by some prior truth, which is something either assumed to be true or else a prior truth that's been already demonstrated, or by truth-preserving rules of inference. Rules we have in deductive logic, there are a number of systems in play, but there are basically within each system certain rules that guarantee that if the rule is correctly applied, that you go from one step to another step, preserving the truth value of the statements. So in other words, you never go from a true statement to a false statement. If you use the rules of inference correctly, you are going to be preserving the truthfulness of your argument. And so that if you use a direct proof and you use rules of inference in a correct way, you're more or less guaranteed that you're going to get a true conclusion to your argument. And so that's a very helpful thing and a very convincing thing. These are so-called truth-preserving rules. Indirect proofs are different, however. It's not always possible to prove things directly, as it turns out, as much as we'd like to. There are many important theorems that cannot be proved directly, and so we have to resort to this indirect proof, and that's a different mode of proof. In order to prove some proposition P, if we can't prove it directly, then what we can do is the following. We can assume the negation of P, that tilde P means not P, or the negation of P, or it is not the case that P, all right? You should read that when you read not P, when you read that connective, and then deduce a contradiction. So if we assume the negation of what we want to prove, and then we deduce a contradiction, we know that if we deduce a contradiction from an assumption, the assumption must be false. So if we assume not P, and then we deduce a contradiction of some kind, and just in general, I'll give you a specific example momentarily, then we know that what we've assumed must be false. In other words, not P is false. But if not P is false, then not P must be true, right? If it is not the case that P, if it is not the case that P is false, then it is not the case that it is not the case that P, and therefore P must be true. And therefore, we've proved P, but we didn't prove it directly. We went in this roundabout, somewhat circuitous route in order to arrive at the conclusion that we desire. And some logicians find this suspicious. There's a particular branch of logic called intuitionism, which actually rejected indirect proof because they really didn't like it. So they tried to reprove everything in mathematics by direct means only. Because they were unable to do that, it turns out that their mathematics theorems are much more limited, or their logical theorems are much more limited. Most people accept them, but there is this sort of a suspect notion. For example, in English, let me give you a quick example of why indirect proofs bother some people. So suppose I say that John, I'm going to type this in, John is like his father. Okay, so I'm just making a simple statement. I'm saying John is like his father. Okay, now logically, it's more or less equivalent to assert that John, if I now say this a different way, John is not unlike his father. All right, I'm now asserting really a double negation, which is equivalent, logically equivalent, right? If I say John is like his father, or if I say John is not unlike his father, it means the same thing logically. You agree? Because to be not unlike something is to be like something. Yeah. Okay. But does it really have the same? Okay. So you're all agreeing and you're correct to agree that logically it may have the same force, but is it the same thing semantically? You know, to assert that John is like his father on the one hand, and then to say, well, John is not unlike his father. Does it really mean the same thing semantically? Or is there possibly some shade of difference? You see what I'm driving at? You're saying, no, it doesn't mean the same thing, right? I mean, it means the same thing logically, but not semantically, right? There's a shade of difference in there, yeah? Yeah, exactly. It implies that they have some differences. To say that John is like his father seems to not so strongly imply that they have differences. But to say that he's not unlike his father leaves some room, right? There's some margin in there, Ahmed. I'm agreeing with you that there's some margin for unlikeness. And so it's, although it's logically more or less equivalent, or grammatically more or less equivalent, semantically, there seems to be some difference there. And I'll give you another example. This, I think, is even more clear. We could say that Jane is a hard worker. Okay, let's say we assert that. Okay, so we're asserting Jane is a hard worker. Okay, that's again, in the positive sense. Now, let's say we say something that may be grammatically equivalent or logically equivalent. I'm going to type that in. No one would say that Jane is not a hard worker. Okay, so we could say Jane is a hard worker. We could also say, no one would say that Jane is not a hard worker. So again, you could see that it may have the same logical force, but I'm claiming that it doesn't really have the same semantic force, right? The second one leaves more room for some kind of doubt, doesn't it? You get it? Okay, so that's how we could claim that double negation is somehow not always equivalent to an affirmation in natural language. In logic, it is. There's no doubt that in a truth table, not P is logically equivalent to P. No one's disputing that. But it's when we get into more semantic contexts that we may be able to detect this sort of margin for lack of equivalency. And that may do some damage to the force of an indirect proof. Not in logic and mathematics, but certainly in more general argumentation. All right. I'm not trying to imbue you with doubt, about indirect proofs. I'm just trying to show that in some contexts, they may not hold up as well as they do in mathematics and logic. Finally, inductive claims I mentioned are subject to confirmation or disconfirmation. Inductive proofs about the world are not very robust at all. For example, again, the claim that all birds fly, you could confirm this day after day in Central Park. All the birds you observe in Central Park probably do fly. But when you observe an ostrich, maybe not in Central Park, but in a zoo or some other place, or in Africa or wherever you happen to be, and observing an ostrich, you realize here's a bird that doesn't fly. Oh, chickens don't fly. Well, I think they can sort of flutter around a little bit. They certainly don't take off and fly very well, but I think they can get off the ground. I'm pretty sure if you chase a chicken, you'll see it running and flapping its wings. It sort of has a bit of lift. In any case, the point is moot. It's very clear that all birds fly is disconfirmable. It's an inductive claim. When we see a few things of a certain kind, or we see a few things or many things that have a certain property, we may want then to generalize and say all things of that kind have that property. That's the inductive leap. It's fine in mathematics and logic, but not so fine in empirical matters. For example, if we say that all compass needles point north, just because every compass we observe is such that the needle points north, we would assume, therefore, that all compass needles point north. That would be true until the Earth's magnetic field flips. And you know that for some strange reason, the polarity of the Earth's magnetic field reverses itself every so often. I don't think anyone knows why, but it's been observed by geophysicists. So on that happy day, suddenly all compass needles are going to point south instead of north. So again, these inductive claims about the world are suspect and susceptible to disconfirmation. Thomas Hobbes, who was, as you know, a great empiricist, he also said, and I quote, "Experience concludeth nothing universally." So no matter what our experience may be about the world, even though it over and over again seemingly reliably confirms some proposition about the world, you never know on a given day whether, in fact, our experience will just as speedily provide a disconfirmation. So that's why inductive claims are not very reliable when we make them about the world, okay? But these are three kinds of proofs. Would direction be subjective? What do you mean by that, Dahlia? What about? Well, okay, I'm almost sorry I brought that up. So David is saying, wouldn't that become the new north? Well, would south become the new north just because the polarity of the magnetic field flips? I mean, we'd still talk about going south for the winter. I mean, we would say it's north because the compass needle's pointing there, but we would still, in a certain way, on a map, be saying we're headed south, right? It would certainly be ambiguous. We had to change all the directions. It would cause problems, David, one way or another. So, Dahlia, would direction be subjective? I guess that's the same question. Yeah, I mean, you could then say that when the magnetic field flips, I mean, I understand you and I agree. You would say that south would be the new north. But then the meaning of language would change fundamentally, right? And we talk about going north for the winter when we're going to Florida, right? We talk about going north for the winter, not south. Okay, so in that case, yes, Dahlia, I guess direction, or at least the names for our directions, would be subjective. If the names for our directions or the names of the predicated on the compass needle pointing north, then yeah, those names are not subjective so much as relative to the direction of the Earth's magnetic field. All right, and so I mean, you can have the same experience. I have, if you ever fly, and I've done it several times from New York, let's say, to Hong Kong, you're going to fly over the pole, more or less directly over the North Pole. It's the shortest route. And then a very, very weird thing happens. If you take off from JFK or Newark in the afternoon and you're sitting on the left side of the plane, what happens is as you're flying north, you realize, of course, that the sun is setting in the west relative to everything we're talking about. So as the plane is flying north in the afternoon, you will watch from the left-hand side of the plane, you'll watch the sunset. But as soon as you go over the pole, east and west are flipped. The compass needle's not changing. You're still going south. Once you get past the North Pole, north becomes south anyway. So you're now flying south. But what's happened is east and west have been reversed. So if you're still awake, you will look out the left-hand side of the plane and suddenly you're looking east, not west. And you'll see the sun come up in the morning on the same side of the plane as it's set. You think about this, you'll see that it's true. And the first time it happened to me, I was a little surprised. I wasn't expecting it. I saw the sun go down on the left side and I saw the sun come up on the left side. But that happens if you fly over the North Pole, and then east and west are going to be switched, although north and south are not. Is this clear? So I'm not so sure direction is subjective in that case, Dahlia, but on a certain axis, it's like a mirror, which is very peculiar, right? Because a mirror, in fact, reverses left and right, but it doesn't reverse up and down. Have you ever thought about that? There's a simple everyday paradox. I didn't mean to get into this today, but we've been kind of guided there. If you look in a mirror, Your left and your left side and your right side are reversed, correct? But your upside and your downside aren't. You're not upside down in the mirror, but your left and your right are reversed. So why does a mirror reverse left and right and not up and down? A mirror reverses, in other words, east and west, but not north and south. I was in the continental US and Canada, Ahmed. I was flying north from New York toward the North Pole. So if you're flying north toward the North Pole, then the sun is on the left. The left side of the plane. It sets on the left side of the plane, which is west. And then as soon as you cross the North Pole, you're still flying in the same geodesic. And now you're flying south because you've crossed the North Pole. You're headed south wherever you are. If you're on the North Pole, every direction is south from there. Now you're flying south, and now suddenly east is on the left side of the plane, where west used to be. That's a little bit strange, but it's verifiable. And if you want to ask how come a mirror reverses left and right, but not up and down, it's a fair question. And I think Martin Gardner answered it in a really informative book about this sort of axes of symmetry. Okay, but in any case, that all had to do with inductive arguments. All right, let's go to a direct proof. And here's an example of a direct proof. Very straightforward. When two straight lines intersect, the opposite angles are equal. That's the theorem, right? Theorem is the thing that we want to prove, right? We want to prove this. And here's a diagram. Any two straight lines, any two, right? As long as they intersect, we know the opposite angles are equal. So RTP required to prove that A is equal to C and B is equal to D. That's a basic geometric theorem. Very easy to prove. You know that is true anyway, probably, but here's a proof. A plus B or 180 degrees. That's by definition. I didn't put in the justifications because I'm assuming you know them or you can easily figure them out. A plus B is 180 degrees by definition. That's a straight line. And similarly, B plus C, those angles are also equal to 180 degrees. It's another straight line by definition. And therefore, A plus B equals B plus C, right? And what's the justification? Well, an axiom from Euclid says that things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. So these things are equal to the same thing, namely 180 degrees, so they're equal to each other. So A plus B equals B plus C, and therefore A equals C. Why? Because we can subtract the same amount from both sides of the equation and not change the equation, right? So therefore A equals C, and that's what we wanted to show, right? Are required to prove that A equals C. And then you don't have to repeat everything because you have a parallel set of the other argument is exactly the same, with substitutions. So you're going to say, similarly, it may be shown that B equals D, okay? Because you can prove that B plus C equals C plus D equals 180 degrees, and therefore B equals D, same argument, right? So you get to see QED. You get to say QED when you prove something if you want to. It means quaderat demonstrandum in Latin, that which was to be shown. So that's why proofs often have QED after them. It's just your way of saying, okay, I proved it. That's trivial proof, right? But it's direct. I hope you get the point. This is a direct proof because each step in the proof, every claim, every premise in the argument, and every conclusion that we draw is in fact justified by an axiom or by a prior result. Is that clear to you? Why it's a direct proof? Is everybody clear about this? Emily's clear. Good. Dahlia's clear. Ganya's clear. Okay, I'm getting a lot of yeses. Thank you. Okay, so it's clear. That's why it's direct. It's very satisfactory. Well, Ahmed, I'm not going to give a real life example because we're dealing here with logic and mathematics. I'm trying to demonstrate this in. If you want a real life example, I can give you a syllogism. Okay. Let's say here's a real life example of a proof. Socrates is a man. Well, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Right? Right? All men are mortal. All right? All men are mortal. That's the first premise. Okay. I'm trying to reply to all, but this is for some reason, this is not working. Everyone, okay? All men are mortal. That's premise one. Socrates is a man. That's premise two. Okay, that's premise two. Therefore what? Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Okay? Clear? Okay, so there's a sort of real world example, at least one that applies to people as opposed to applying to geometric constructs. But it's the same thing. It's a direct proof, except that this comes from, well, that's an inductive observation. We've never seen an immortal person. So we everybody who's born dies. So that's inductive. So it's not really proven. Okay. Socrates is a man may be more provable. So we have assumed something here. But in any case, now let's go to indirect proof. Why I'm doing this, Anselm's proof is indirect. Okay. That's the important thing. Again, you assume the inverse of what you want to prove and derive a contradiction. That's the strategy of an indirect proof. If you can derive a contradiction from an assumption, your assumption must be false. That means that the negation of what you want to prove is false, since you've assumed the negation of what you want to prove. If the negation of what you want to prove is false, well, then the negation of a negation is false, so the affirmation must be true, and therefore what you want to prove must be true. And that's the sort of roundabout strategy that you follow. That's the form of an indirect proof. And here's an example, the proof by contradiction. It's fairly trivial. It's just a bit of algebra. We want to prove the following thing underlined in green. If n squared is even, then n is even. Okay? And common sense will tell you this has to be the case, but it's not strong enough. We need to prove it. So if n squared is even, n is any integer, right? Any integer you want. If n squared is even, then n is even. Okay, you can try it at home. You'll never find a case that isn't such that if n squared is even, n is even, but we still want to prove it. So we have to, in this case, do it by contradiction. We can't prove it directly. So what we do is we assume something else that we can falsify. We assume that that n squared is even, but n is odd, right? That's the opposite of this thing, right? We want to assume n squared is even, but n is odd. Okay, so since n is odd, then we know that n has the form 2k plus 1, because every odd number is expressible as the sum 2k plus 1, where k is an integer, all right? Okay, by definition. So that means that n squared, now we expand n squared in terms of 2k plus 1. So we just expand that and we get this, and we can simplify it as 2 times 2k plus 2 plus 1. Okay, then we say let m equal this thing, 2k squared plus 2k is m. So that means n squared is 2m plus 1. But if n squared is 2m plus 1, that means by definition, n squared is odd. You see, it's underlined in red because we've now contradicted what we assumed. Yeah? We've now proven, in fact, something contrary to what we've assumed. We've assumed n squared is even, and we've just shown that n squared is odd. By assuming that, if n squared is even, n is also even. So since we've derived a contradiction, we know that something up there must be false, and it's obviously impossible for n squared to be odd and even at the same time. So we reached a contradiction, and the assumption that we made was false, and that was the assumption. We assumed n squared is even, but n is odd. That must be the thing that's false. And if it's false that n is odd, it must be true that n is even. And therefore, we've proven by indirect means, by contradiction, that if n squared is even, then n is even as well, QED. That's what we set out to prove. But we couldn't prove it directly, so we proved it by indirect proof, or reductio ad absurdum. In other words, by deriving a contradiction. Okay, I hope that's clear. Just work through the algebra. You'll see it's fairly trivial. Okay, but it's the structure that I want you to understand, because this is also going to be akin to the structure of Anselm's proof, although it's actually not this complicated. But that's the form of a proof by contradiction. And there are many, many such things. Now let's go to Anselm, okay? And there are two background assumptions that you need to digest in order to appreciate Anselm's proof. And the two, and you can quarrel with these if you want, but I'm going to now be an advocate for Anselm, and not the devil's advocate, but Anselm's advocate. And I want to illustrate to you, you can read Anselm, please do. He's in your textbook. The reading is in the text, and you can find it there. But basically, I'm going to give you the two background assumptions to his proof. Firstly, Anselm claims a thing, anything at all, a thing that exists both in the imagination and in reality is greater than a thing that exists in the imagination alone. This is an important assumption. He needs this assumption. In fact, without this assumption, his proof doesn't go through. So what do we mean by this? A thing that exists both in the imagination and in reality is greater than a thing that exists in the imagination alone. Let me offer an example or two to you, and then maybe you can come up with some of your own. So I ask you suppose I ask you the following question. What's greater, a fantastic meal that you imagine cooking, or a fantastic meal that you imagine cooking and then you actually cook it and eat it? What's greater? Which of the two? The thing that was only in your imagination, or the thing that was in your imagination and which also ended up existing in reality? The second one, yeah, cooking and eating, right. Okay, good. I mean, that's what I want you to say, but I want you to understand why. Similarly, we could talk about, yeah, you're all getting this right away. That's what Anselm wants to suggest. Similarly, what's better? What's greater? The perfect vacation that you imagine taking, or the perfect vacation that you plan out in your imagination and you actually take that vacation, right? Anselm, again, would say it's greater both to, plan it in your imagination or to dream it up and then to actually take that vacation, right? It's the same argument. You get it? Are you with me? Or are you with him? Yes. Okay. Thank you. All right, good. And similarly, what's greater, the book that you imagine writing or the book that you actually imagine writing and then write? We'd say that's a greater book. Or what's a greater movie, the movie that you imagine making or the movie that you actually imagine making and then you make? Most great movies were imagined before they were made. And Anselm is saying that the one that you actually make is going to be greater than the one that exists in the imagination alone. Of course, we may have to imagine it first, but then the one that we actually succeeded making is greater in that sense, right? Or, the perfect date is, what's greater, the one that, the perfect date you imagine or the perfect date you imagine, then you actually go out on that date. So Anselm would say the one you actually experience is greater than the one that exists in the imagination alone. Are we clear? It's an important premise. It's a vital premise, okay? So anything of that sort, anything that exists both in the imagination and in reality, says Anselm, is greater in that sense than a thing that exists in the imagination alone. All right. That's one background assumption, absolutely vital. Okay. And I see that most of you are willing to go along with it for those reasons. Okay. Second assumption, this is a little, maybe a little trickier. I'm giving you Anselm's wording, and then I'll give you what I claim to be an equivalent wording. Does no violence to the argument. Anselm says God is a thing, meaning an entity, right? Of which none greater can be thought. Those are actually Anselm's words. If you read his English, which has been modernized since the 11th century, but he probably wrote it in Latin, actually. But anyway, it's been translated as this: God is a thing of which none greater can be thought, meaning there's nothing greater that we can think of than God. Yeah. If there's nothing greater than we can think of than God, then God is the greatest thinkable thing or the greatest conceivable being. And I'm saying those are all loosely synonymous. So you can phrase it in the positive. It's easier for us to grasp that God is the greatest conceivable thing rather than God is that thing of which none greater can be thought. But those phrases are equivalent in their intent. Is this clear? There's nothing greater than God. In other words, nothing greater than God. Is that clear? Is everybody clear about that premise as well? Yes. Okay. However you phrase it, okay? However you phrase it. So these are the two background assumptions, and you're clear on both of them, and that means we can go straight to his argument. And some of you are going to, in a minute, are going to be, I'm sure it'll blow your minds. It's the first time you see this. Or it'll make you laugh, or it'll make you very puzzled. Or some of you won't get it right away, and you have to think about it for a minute, and then the light will come on. So given these two background assumptions, you're going to see them in the argument itself momentarily. So I'm going to give you my take, or my version of the argument, 7 steps. I boiled it down for you. I want you to read his text anyway, but I'm giving you this as a kind of synopsis. So Anselm wants to prove that God truly exists, right? That's his theorem. And remember, he's assuming that God is the greatest conceivable being, or God is that being than which no greater can be thought. Okay, so here's Anselm's argument. Step 1, just like everything else, he's going to say God exists either in the imagination alone, right? Either God exists in the imagination alone. In other words, God is something we thought up, but has no existence outside the imagination. Some people would say that. Or God exists both in the imagination and in reality, right? That's the other possibility. Has to be one of the two. Presumably has to be one of the two. And either God is a figment of our imaginations, or in fact, God exists not only in our imaginations, but actually God really exists. Yeah, that's a disjunction, right? There's one branch of the argument, and there's another branch of the argument, right? Those are the two possibilities, either or. So let's take the second possibility first. If God exists in both the imagination and in reality, then obviously God truly exists, right? I mean, if God exists in the imagination and reality, then God truly exists. No question about that. But what about the first part? And this is where he's going to apply an indirect proof. So we're going to assume for the moment that God exists in the imagination alone and derive a contradiction. Yeah, you get the strategy? That's the strategy of indirect proof. By assuming that God exists in the imagination alone and deriving a contradiction, Anselm will show that it must be false that God exists in the imagination alone. And if it's false that God exists in the imagination alone, then it must be true that God exists both in the imagination and reality, and therefore God truly exists as well. So it doesn't matter which of these you take to be true. In fact, if you take this one to be true, it will lead you to a contradiction, and therefore it will lead you to the second one. In both cases, we'll have to admit this. And that's the overall strategy. So number 2 is just a reaffirmation of the second disjunct, namely that if God exists in the imagination and in reality, then of course God truly exists. Now we'll go back at step 3. We go back to this one. Suppose this is the case. Here's the interesting thing about his argument, the really fascinating thing. Suppose that God exists in the imagination alone. We're going to suppose that. But then, remember, God is the greatest conceivable being, right? By definition. That's our assumption. So if God exists in the imagination alone, says Anselm, then the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, because that's our definition of God, the greatest conceivable being. So if God exists in the imagination alone, then the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone. But then that immediately leads to a contradiction. Why? Because if the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, then the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest conceivable being. Why not? Because if the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, I can conceive of a greater one, namely that being which exists both in the imagination and in reality. So the greatest conceivable being cannot exist in the imagination alone, for then it would not be the greatest conceivable being. And therefore, the greatest conceivable being must exist both in the imagination and in reality. And therefore, he concludes, God truly exists, QED. So from number 1, he's able to derive number 7, no matter which fork, no matter which branch you choose, no matter which disjunct you choose, you're going to end up having to conclude that God truly exists. Has anybody followed this all the way through the first time? Does anybody get this right away? And we have a hand already by Ahmed. Okay. Go ahead, Ahmed. Do you want to speak or do you want to type?
Yeah, I would like to speak.
Please.
So I understand this and I want to try to disprove it.
Already? Okay, so you first of all, the first thing first, okay? You can take a number. There's a lot of philosophers who've done a lot of work to disprove this. But first you understand his proof, right? Or what he thinks he's proven and
Yeah.
why. That's the main thing. You do get his argument, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. So what's your objection then to his argument?
Okay, so I wrote this down. So Kant stated that if an object exists, then that object is not perfect. So, for example, we could say that unicorns exist. But if we say that the unicorn is the most perfect horse, so we can imagine that the unicorn exists, even if the unicorn does not exist. But if you say that the unicorn exists, it doesn't mean that it's more perfect than the unicorn that does not exist. So the unicorn does not have to exist. And therefore, even though I believe in God, that by this logic, if the unicorn does not have to exist, then God does not have to exist
Right.
as
Okay.
well.
That's very good. And basically, you've summed up salient subjection, and it's part, but you've thrown in a few other frills. Okay. Let me say this to you on Thursday. I promise we're going to tackle that in depth. All right. But you've also actually, in your refutation, you've given about 2 or 3 different kinds of refutations all bundled into one, but focused on the main thing about existence not being what Kant would call not a predicate of anything. But you've also thrown something else into the mix to make it more interesting, actually, and also more complicated, namely that just by defining things or by naming things, we don't necessarily bring them into existence, right? So, going to your example about the unicorn, suppose we say that unicorns exist. I'm not talking about perfection now. I'm just talking about unicorns. I'm going to ask the class, do unicorns exist? Now, some of you may be reluctant to answer because you know that there's all kinds of traps in which we can be caught. Some of you were saying yes, some of you were saying no, and some of you were saying possibly. Okay, so one of you says in the imagination, or maybe, right? So this is pretty inconclusive, huh? Yes, well, unicorns certainly exist in the imagination. Is that correct? I mean, we would all agree we can imagine a unicorn, right? But do they exist in reality? Well, can't I can go into a toy store and buy one, right? A lot of people have stuffed unicorns at home, don't they? So unicorns exist then. But if you're asking about the unicorn as a horse with a horn, is there a biological, we could ask the question differently. Is there such an animal as as a biological unicorn, which actually reproduces and, gives birth to baby unicorns, I guess very carefully if they're born with horns. But anyway, being born head first with a horn be very tricky for the mother. But in any case, if unicorns are biological entities, no one's discovered one on Earth, right? Not yet. We assume that they don't exist as biological entities. But who's to say there aren't unicorns on another planet? We don't know, right? Fair to say? So we don't know. So basically, we can't rule unicorns in or out. We don't really have a proof that unicorns exist, or nor do we have a proof that unicorns don't exist. We can certainly say they exist in the imagination. Whether or not they exist in reality is still that remains to be determined. And remember, inductively, visiting any number of planets that don't have unicorns on them never proves to us that unicorns don't exist, because we don't know. Maybe one day we'll find a planet where there are unicorns. Yeah. So in that case, we don't know. But your other point, Ahmed, and I want to return to this notion of perfection, because the first objection made to this, and the objection that you really started giving before you got to Kant, although you mentioned Kant off the bat, it's a related but a different objection that is made by a monk, Gonilo. He's a contemporary of Anselm. And the monk Gonilo actually made that same objection in your text. And it's in there. And Gonilo said, if I can imagine the perfect tropical island, let's say, Gonilo is then going to use Anselm's logic, or attempt to say, well, if I can imagine the perfect tropical island, then of course the greatest conceivable island must exist in reality. If it exists in my imagination alone, it's not the greatest conceivable island, because I could imagine a greater one, right? Namely, the one that exists in my imagination and in reality. So by that logic, says Gonilo, if I can imagine the greatest conceivable tropical island, then it must exist in reality. So I should obviously set sail looking for it. And Anselm says, no, that's not a viable objection. And he'll explain why. And I'll get into that with you on Thursday, and your instructors also can get into that with you. It's a fairly straightforward refutation, and it hinges on something that Ahmed said about necessary existence, or about things that exist necessarily. So there is that kind of objection. And Kant made a different kind of objection as well, which we'll look at. So before all these objections come up, and they're very good ones, I do want the majority of you, if not everybody, to understand the main argument. Okay, that's the real key. Before it's germane for us to anticipate objections to the argument, it's really necessary to understand the argument. So we'll just go back over it again once more. Some of you may not have gotten it the first time around, and that would be normal. It's definitely a bit of a counterintuitive exercise. So remember, God's the greatest conceivable being. That's the key. And either God exists in the imagination alone, or God exists both in the imagination and reality. Those seem to be the only two choices in the matter. And in the second case, if the latter disjunct is true, and God exists both in the imagination and reality, then of course God truly exists. On the other hand, suppose that God exists in the imagination alone. Well, if God exists in the imagination, and here's the key, we can derive a contradiction from that. Because if God exists in the imagination alone, supposedly, and God is the greatest conceivable being, then we're asserting that the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone. But then, says Anselm, that's a contradiction, because in that case, the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest conceivable being, because the greatest conceivable being would be a being that exists not only in the imagination, but also in reality. So if you assert that God exists in the imagination alone, you're asserting that the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone. And Anselm says, but then I can always conceive of something greater, namely that being which exists both in the imagination and reality. So you'd be contradicting yourself, because you'd be saying that the greatest conceivable being, if it exists in the imagination alone, is actually not the greatest conceivable being. That's the contradiction. And therefore, says Anselm, the greatest conceivable being must exist both in the imagination and in reality. And therefore, God truly exists. No matter which of these disjuncts you seize to be true, or assume to be true, presumed to be true, it will turn out that God truly exists. So that's the ontological argument. Are more people clearer now about how that argument works? Just back to the basics for a moment. Are more of you clear? Yes, now good. Sometimes you need to go through it, particularly from step 3 to step 5. That's where he resorts to this indirect proof. And I've spent a lot of time with you. I think it's really time well spent, because if you have in your minds the form of an indirect proof, then you'll be able to recognize various manifestations of it. Or as Plato would say, copies. If you have the pure form of an indirect proof in your mind, you'll recognize the copies when you encounter them, to revert to, Plato's account. Of course, Plato was long before Anselm. I don't think he was aware of Anselm. It couldn't have been. But, okay, what are the third option? Oh, that's really interesting, Cale. I like that one. A third option, namely that God doesn't exist in your imagination or reality. Well, that's really interesting. Is it possible that God doesn't exist in your imagination? Because isn't the very fact of your denial of that, in a certain sense, contradiction? I think this is a great question.
The concept of God that exists in my imagination is not, I was raised completely agnostic. I've never even sat through one religious service of any type of religion.
That's fine. That's got nothing to do with the logic, however.
The concept of God that exists in my imagination is not necessarily one who would have to be the most, because it's the same, sorry if this offends people, but like the version of God that exists in my imagination is the same as the version of unicorns that exists in my imagination. which is to say that if they were real, sure, this horse would have a horn and be able to fly. Sure, if God was real, he might be the most powerful or whatever. But like,
Okay.
it's not more rooted in my mind than a unicorn.
All right. So you're saying that if God, but are you not, didn't you just say, if I heard you correctly, and I'm going to give you Anselm's answer because Anselm has an answer for you. You may not like it, but I'll give you Anselm's answer in a moment. But first, what I thought you said was that if God existed, then God would be the greatest conceivable being.
No, I was saying that I mean, I guess I don't know, because I don't believe that, but
Right. I know you don't, but this is logic supposedly has nothing to do with what we believe,
I see.
right? This is the cutting point where we're just assuming certain things to be true for the sake of argument and seeing where they lead, right? So you said you were an agnostic, if I heard you correctly, and an agnostic is someone who, as you've just said, it doesn't know. An agnostic is someone who would presumably believe if it were proved reasonably, or would disbelieve if it were disproved, right? An agnostic is somebody by definition without knowledge. In other words, you don't know for sure either way, correct?
Correct.
Okay, that's the definition. So an agnostic ought to be, I'm thinking, an agnostic ought to be willing to assume for the sake of argument that, you know, maybe God doesn't exist, but if God did exist, then God would be the greatest conceivable being.
I guess
Because
it's a trap because you can't admit to believing in an idea of God without having to concede that God would have to be the most powerful. So you have
right.
to, yeah.
Right. And that's where Anselm catches us up. And so let me give you his answer to his may or may not satisfy you. I think your objection is a very interesting one. But here's what Anselm says, and it's in his text, okay? You can read it for yourself in his own words, or rather in our translation. So Anselm is talking to the atheist, which is a stronger position, right? Your position as agnostic is actually a moderate position because you're neither a believer nor a non-believer, correct? That's what agnosticism means. It's actually more difficult in a certain sense to be, I think, between the two. But an atheist is someone who disbelieves, correct? An atheist is asserting something more definitive, namely that God does not exist, right? That's what an atheist would say, correct?
Yep.
That's not a trick. I'm just saying an atheist says God does not exist. So here's Anselm's reply to the atheist, because there were atheists in his day too, not very many. But here's Anselm. Anselm says that the atheist is contradicting himself. So if you assert, it's, you know, basically what you just said. Anselm is saying that if you're not an atheist, but Anselm is saying the atheist asserts that God does not exist. And therefore, he argues the atheist is asserting that the greatest conceivable being does not exist. And that, says Anselm, is a contradiction in terms. Because if you assert that the greatest conceivable being does not exist, then it's not the greatest conceivable being. Because the greatest conceivable being exists both in imagination and in reality. So if you deny the existence of the greatest conceivable being, says Anselm, you're actually contradicting yourself. And I want you all to get a handle on that. That's Anselm's reply to the atheist. It's not Anselm's reply to you, Cale, but it's Anselm's reply to the atheist, all right? The atheist denies that God exists. Anselm says you can't do that without contradicting yourself, because denying the existence of God is denying the existence of the greatest conceivable being. But if you deny the existence of the greatest conceivable being, it's a contradiction. So there's silence. I like it. It means you're all thinking. And that's the main thing. I want you to think about this, about this argument. It's very clear. I think you will admit to this point, presumably, that whether you agree with it or not, and you may have different reasons for being perturbed by it. You may have different reasons for agreeing with it. But I think one is bound to admit that it's pretty clever, especially for someone in the, a monk in the 11th century, 1,000 years ago, he came up with this, and people are still finding it intriguing. And I think that's evidence that is interesting, at least. I'm not supposing that he proves beyond the shadow of a doubt that God exists. I'm just supposing the fact that we are still debating this, and there are people who are still debating this 1,000 years later, shows us that the argument has some merit, has something interesting about it, which from generation to generation continues to attract our, let's say, our powers of analysis. Complex, yes, I certainly agree with you there, Gianna. It's not a simple argument, and it may in the end be convoluted, but it makes sense based on, well, exactly. If you follow Anselm's reasoning, then it certainly would seem to be proving the existence of God if we accept his definition, right? If we accept those two background assumptions that we looked at earlier, then yeah, it would seem that if we accept these two premises, then definitely he seems to have proved that God exists. But now we're going to look at, again, we're going to look at some of the really interesting objections that philosophers have raised, and which in your own objections today from Ahmed and from Kale, you have both implicated historically some of these important objections as well. But again, I think that in the first place, it's important for you to be able to digest the argument as it stands, and then it will make sense for us next day to pursue objections. So could you say that the assumption he made makes it very hard to refute? Well, it depends what you mean by hard to refute. Okay, Lenise, because actually some of the refutations that have been made were not very hard at all. They were just the product of other ways of thinking about things. But certainly those of you who are encountering this for the first time, I would be surprised if you didn't find it hard to refute, because, not being familiar with the literature, certainly encountering this the first time might lend you, reason to believe it, especially if you believe the background assumptions or accept them for the sake of argument. How does a non-monotheist? That's another very interesting question by Kale. I like these questions. How does a non-monotheist react? Okay, so by a non-monotheist, now a monotheist means someone who believes in one God. So that this argument obviously is intended for people of monotheistic faith, namely primarily the Abrahamic faiths with which Anselm would have been aware, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all monotheistic. However, how would a non-monotheist react to this? Interesting question. By non-monotheist, we don't necessarily mean an atheist. We mean, for example, a pluralist, right? As in Indian philosophy, to take one example, where there are a multitude of gods, not just one god, there are many, many, many gods and goddesses. There are huge hierarchies of gods and goddesses. So how would a non-monotheist react? I'll have to ask my Indian friends. I have several Indian friends who are philosophers. I've never actually asked any of them. I don't know if they're aware of this, but there is still one chief god in Indian philosophy, right? Brahman, which is the absolute reality. And that absolute reality subsumes a whole pantheon of other deities, as well as the ancient Greeks, for example, who had all these gods living on Olympus, right? Another pantheon of deities. So maybe it's the case that they could revert to the chief deity, because in Greek, as in Roman theology, there's still one in charge, right? Isn't it Zeus in Greek, who's the top? He's like the CEO, chief executive god, or the CEG, right? Chief executive god. And in Hinduism, you have Brahman, which is the absolute reality, not a personification, but absolute reality. So I think this would go through. To me, prima facie, if you said that absolute reality exists in the imagination alone, or absolute reality exists both in the imagination and in reality, I think once again, by definition, you're going to say that if absolute reality exists only in the imagination, Kale and others, this is not absolute reality, right? So if absolute reality exists in the imagination alone, it's not absolute reality. So there's the same contradiction will manifest itself. So I think it would work in Indian philosophy. And I'm going to ask my Indian philosopher friend in particular. Okay, so I think that for non-monotheism, provided they have a chief god or an absolute reality, I think the same argument would go through. And I just want to show you in passing before we wrap this up today, and thank you for your contributions. Really interesting that you follow this and that you've come up already with some interesting possible objections to it. And again, our job next day will be to assess the most salient objections that have been made historically, and they will also dovetail with some of what you have come up with today. So good job on your parts to be on the ball and coming up with, with credible objections to this. Whether you believe in God or not, again, is beside the point. We're looking at the logic, right? That's not dependent on our particular faith or in fact, lack of faith, absence of faith. So let me share with you a link in your Google Drive folders, just to be mindful for next day and in general for your other breakout lectures. I have also prepared a link for you to a website, if I can find it, that gives for you the actual other. I have a really good synopsis of objections. That's what I'm talking about. Let me just pull that up for you if I'm able to. But there's a link in your Google Drive folders in Supplementary Materials, Part 3, and it's called Objections to Anselm. And that's the thing I just want to pull up if I can. And I'm not seeing it right here for some reason or other. Don't know why. But it's there, I assure you. It is there. I just don't understand where at this moment. There it is. Screen sharing is stopped. Let me try once more. Zoom is being a little finicky at this moment. I've pulled up this thing. I'm going to close the ontological argument, and hopefully this will allow me now to share with you the screen. There it is. By magic. Okay, so now that link anyway is in your Google Drive folders, so you don't have to worry about it. But if you actually follow that link, then what you're going to pull up is, I think, a really interesting page which contains the actual objections. And if you go to that page, I don't know where that page went. I may have now closed that page. So I'm going to try and pull it up once more. I'm going to copy that link and paste it in. And this is really I think, a very good set of objections, but I'm not able to find it right now. This is giving me trouble today. You'll pardon me. So there's always some issue. Control C, and let me just paste it in. Control V. All right, now this is the screen I want to share, and hopefully this time I can do it. And there it is. Okay, sorry for the delay. This link in your Google Drive folder takes you to one page, one web page, which is really great because it contains the most salient objections from the earliest times, including the monk Gaunilo and his objection about the perfect island and Anselm's reply. And it also contains Thomas Aquinas, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, very powerful objection by Kant, and some modern objections by other philosophers, including Bertrand Russell and so forth. So this is what I'm going to go over with you on my particular breakout group, Section M, on Thursday. And I hope your instructors will also go over these arguments with you as well. Okay, and that it will take us to both, the plausibility of Anselm's ontological proof, and also what kinds of very serious objections could be raised against it. Okay, that'll be our job going forward. It's hopefully been an interesting class for you today, and you want to think about this argument and look ahead, if you like, to the objections. And we will meet again this Thursday, some of you. The rest of you, I hope you'll look at the objections in your breakout groups. And next week, we'll have 2 weeks left after this one. We're going to look at a hugely important model called the prisoner's dilemma. That's next on the agenda. Okay, so thank you very much. You're more than welcome, all of you. Have a wonderful week. The file is located in your Google Drive folder, Supplementary Materials, Part 3. You will find that link. Okay, I promise. Just copy and paste that link into your browser. All right? And your instructors have it too. Okay, take care, everybody. Have a wonderful day. All the classes should have that link. Your instructors all should have that link. Okay, take good care now. And thank you very much for your attention. Yes. I'm going to stop the recording now, and then there's a question which I'll be glad to take, okay?